The energy barrier shimmered as a guard hurried past Lyra's confinement, avoiding her gaze. A slight smile played on Lyra's lips as she traced a finger along the shimmering field, emerald skin sparking against the blue energy. The resulting ripples made the guard flinch and quicken his pace, clearly intimidated by the woman within. "Leaving so soon?" Lyra called, her melodious voice echoing through the sterile corridors of the orbital detention facility. The guard vanished without a word, leaving her to the constant hum of the containment field. Lyra returned to her usual position on the cot, legs gracefully folded. The standard-issue jumpsuit did little to disguise her elegant form, subtly altered during her months of confinement to be somewhat more becoming. The cell block door hissed open, and Lyra didn't bother to look up, anticipating another nervous guard on their rounds. A new voice, however, broke the silence. Confident, amused, distinctly masculine. "So, this is where they're keeping the galaxy's most formidable woman. I expected more restraints, perhaps some dramatic mood lighting." Lyra's gaze snapped up. A man stood outside her cell, dressed in civilian attire rather than a uniform. Dark hair with a touch of silver at the temples, an athletic build, and a teasing half-smile that hinted at his amusement. "And you are?" Lyra inquired, her voice cool despite her piqued curiosity. "Elias Thorne. But my friends call me Eli." He pulled up the single chair outside her cell, settling in as if for a casual conversation rather than an interrogation. "I'm here to review your file." "Another scientist come to study the anomaly?" Lyra rose gracefully, approaching the energy field. Most recoiled from her presence, but Eli remained still. "Shall I give you a demonstration of my disruptive potential?" "Actually, I was hoping we could discuss quantum entanglement and your particular aptitude for manipulating atomic structures." His eyes held genuine interest. "Though a demonstration wouldn't be unwelcome, provided we can keep the structural damage to a minimum." Lyra blinked, taken aback. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish." "I prefer scientifically inquisitive." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Tell me, when you deconstruct matter at the atomic level, can you direct the dispersal, or is it more of an uncontrolled chain reaction? Are you genuinely asking me technical questions about my talents? Would you prefer I tremble in fear, like the rest?" Eli raised an eyebrow. "I find your capabilities fascinating, theoretically speaking. The potential applications could revolutionize everything, from infrastructure development to interstellar travel. The practical application is that I obliterate anything I touch," Lyra stated, a hint of bitterness in her voice, though she found herself drawn into the conversation despite herself. "That's why I'm in this cage." "Everything?" Eli stood, approaching the energy field until only inches separated them. "Yet you manage to wear clothing, consume food, even rest on that cot without reducing them to their basic components. It seems to me you have more control than you're letting on." Their eyes met through the shimmering barrier. For the first time in months, Lyra felt seen as something other than a threat. It was unnerving. "You're different from the others they send," she admitted. "I'll consider that a compliment." His smile widened. "Though, technically, they didn't send me. I may have acquired some credentials to gain access." "You broke into a maximum security prison just to discuss science with me?" "Well, when you phrase it that way, it does sound rather reckless." Eli shrugged. "But I've reviewed your file. There are inconsistencies. And I have an aversion to unsolved mysteries." Lyra found herself suppressing a smile. "So you're not just brave and foolish, you're also criminally irresponsible." "I prefer romantically impulsive to dot." He winked. "Besides, the security here is surprisingly rudimentary. They rely too heavily on reputation. No one attempts a breach because they're terrified of you. And you're not afraid of a woman who can manipulate the fundamental forces of nature?" "Terrified," he said, his tone making it clear he was anything but. "Though I'm more concerned about what my mother would say if she knew I was showing interest in a notorious figure." Lyra couldn't contain it. She laughed. The sound, unexpected and echoing, surprised them both. "You're showing interest in me?" Attempting to, at least. Is it working? I could disintegrate you without even touching you, she reminded him, though the edge had left her voice. But you haven't yet, he countered, which I choose to interpret as encouragement. Eli glanced at his watch. Unfortunately, my borrowed credentials won't fool the system much longer. I should leave before the real Dr. Thorne arrives. He paused at the door. Oh, and Lyra? When the energy grid fluctuates in precisely 37 minutes, the containment field will drop for exactly 2.3 seconds. Just in case you were feeling romantically impulsive yourself. The energy barrier shimmered, and a guard scurried past Ilara's cell, studiously avoiding her gaze. A faint smile touched Ilara's lips as she ran a fingertip along the shimmering field, her jade skin sparking against the azure energy. The ripples that spread from her touch made the guard wince and hurry away, clearly unnerved by the woman contained within. Off so soon? Ilara's musical voice echoed through the sterile halls of the orbital detention center. The guard disappeared without a word, leaving her to the low hum of the containment field. Ilara resumed her usual pose on the cot, legs elegantly crossed. The regulation jumpsuit couldn't entirely conceal her graceful figure, subtly tailored over the months of her confinement to be somewhat more suitable. The cell block door hissed open, and Ilara didn't look up, expecting another jittery guard on patrol. A different voice, however, broke the silence. Assured, playful, and unmistakably male. So, this is where they're holding the most dangerous woman in known space. I anticipated more security measures, maybe some dramatic lighting. Ilara's eyes flew open. A man stood outside her cell, dressed in civilian clothes, not a uniform. His dark hair was streaked with silver at his temples, he had an athletic physique and a teasing smile that suggested he was finding the situation amusing. And you are? Ilara asked, her tone cool despite her rising curiosity. Call me Reese. Reese Vance. My friends call me Reese. He pulled up the single chair outside her cell, settling in as though for a friendly chat, not an interrogation. I'm here to go over your case file. Another researcher here to analyze the anomaly? Ilara rose fluidly, moving towards the energy field. Most people flinched from her presence, but Reese didn't budge. Would you like me to give you a demonstration of my disruptive capabilities? Actually, I was hoping we could talk about quantum entanglement and your unique skill in manipulating atomic structures. His eyes held genuine interest. Although, a demonstration wouldn't be out of the question, assuming we can avoid any significant damage to the facility. Ilara blinked, surprised. You're either remarkably brave or remarkably reckless. Let's say a scientifically curious, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Tell me, when you disassemble matter at the atomic level, can you control where the particles go, or is it a more random chain reaction? Says the woman with a small army trying to kill her, Ren countered as another explosion. Would you prefer I tremble before you, like the others? Reese raised an eyebrow. I find your abilities quite intriguing, theoretically speaking. The possible uses could completely change everything, from building infrastructure to interstellar transport. The practical use is that I annihilate anything I come into contact with, Ilara said, a touch of bitterness in her voice, even as she found herself pulled into the conversation. That's why I'm in this cage. Anything? Reese stood, approaching the energy field until only a few centimeters separated them. And yet you seem to be managing to wear clothing, consume food, and even use that cot without it reverting to its component parts. Seems to me you have more control than you're admitting. Their eyes met across the shimmering barrier. For the first time in months, Ilara felt like she was being seen as something other than a danger. It was disarming. You're different from the others they send, she admitted. I'll take that as a compliment. His smile broadened. Although, to be precise, they didn't send me. I may have acquired some credentials to get in. You broke into a maximum security prison just to discuss quantum physics with me? Well, when you say it like that, it does sound a tad impulsive. Reese shrugged. But I've looked over your file. Some things don't add up. And I have a strong dislike for unanswered questions. Ilara felt a smile trying to break through. So, you're not just brave and reckless, you're also wildly irresponsible. I prefer hopelessly romantic, he winked. Besides, the security here is shockingly simple. They depend far too much on your reputation. No one tries anything because they're scared of you. And you're not afraid of a woman who can control the basic building blocks of the universe? Petrified, he said, his tone making it clear he was anything but. Although I'm more concerned about what my mother would say if she knew I was showing an interest in a notorious character. Ilara couldn't help it. A laugh escaped her. The unexpected sound, ringing in the sterile corridor, caught them both off guard. You're showing an interest in me? Trying to, at any rate. Any success? I could obliterate you without even laying a finger on you, she reminded him, but the harshness had vanished from her voice. But you haven't yet, he pointed out, which I'm choosing to consider a positive sign. Reese looked at his watch. Regrettably, my borrowed credentials won't keep fooling the system for much longer. I should leave before the actual Dr. Vance shows up. He paused at the door. Oh, and Ilara? When the power grid fluctuates in precisely 37 minutes, the containment field will be deactivated for exactly 2.3 seconds. Just in case you happen to be feeling hopelessly romantic yourself. The lights flickered again, a predictable power surge just before the promised disruption. Rena didn't need to look at the chronometer on her wrist, she knew precisely when the containment field would falter. 2.3 seconds. Enough time to step through, but not enough for the guards to react. When the azure energy shimmered and faded, she moved, her bare feet silent on the cold metal floor. The corridor was deserted, quieter than usual. Dan's warning echoed in her mind, there's always a plan B. She just hadn't expected him to be part of it. He materialized from the shadows, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Impressive timing, he murmured, pulling her toward a darkened service corridor. Though, you might want to work on your peripheral vision. I was standing there for a good minute. I was assessing the situation, Rena retorted, though she didn't resist his touch. His hand was surprisingly warm against her emerald skin. Sure you were, he whispered, his breath close to her ear. Wandering around a maximum security prison like you're looking for the gift shop. He steered her through the labyrinthine maintenance tunnels. Unless you'd prefer to put on a show for the guards, the exit is this way. Rena allowed herself to be guided, hyper-aware of his presence beside her, the brush of their shoulders in the confined space. You planned this, she accused softly, not a question. Every detail. Almost every detail, Dan admitted, pausing at a junction to check a small device. You being even more captivating up close wasn't part of the original calculations. Do you ever stop, she asked, though she found herself smiling despite the danger. Stop what, he countered, resuming their swift pace. Would you prefer I not appreciate your attributes? Before Rena could formulate a response, alarms blared through the station. Dan swore under his breath. That's a bit sooner than expected. Time for Plan B. There's a Plan B? There's always a Plan B, he repeated, pulling her into a run. Though, fair warning, this one involves significantly more explosions. They burst into a wider corridor just as a squad of guards rounded the corner. Rena instinctively raised her hand, power crackling at her fingertips, ready to unleash the destructive force that had made her both famous and feared. Wait, Dan's grip tightened on her arm. Third panel on the left wall. Just enough to crack the seal. Understanding dawned. With the precise control she rarely employed, Rena directed a focused burst of energy at the indicated panel. It cracked open along the seam, releasing a cloud of suppressant gas designed to subdue escaped prisoners. Now run. They sprinted past the choking, disoriented guards, Dan navigating the maze-like corridors with uncanny familiarity. He must have memorized the entire station layout. Almost there, he panted, as a massive security door slammed down in front of them, blocking their escape. And that, Rena stated dryly, would be where Plan B comes in. Dan grinned, producing a small device from his pocket. Care to combine our talents? Rena studied the door, then the device, a slow smile spreading across her face. You know, she said, stepping closer, most men just buy me dinner. Tell you what, Dan replied, attaching the explosive charge to the door, we survive this, and I'll cook you the best meal you've ever had. Deal? Is that a promise? That's a date. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, the alarms, the approaching guards, the imminent danger, all faded away. Then, Dan stepped back and triggered the charge. As the explosion weakened the door's molecular structure, Rena released her power with surgical precision. The combined effect created a perfect breach, just large enough for them to slip through. They emerged into a small docking bay where a sleek, black ship waited. The sound of approaching boots echoed behind them. Ladies first, Dan said, gesturing to the ship's ramp. Such a gentleman, Rena laughed, sprinting aboard. Dan followed, already initiating the launch sequence before the ramp fully closed. Through the viewport, Rena watched as guards poured into the bay, their weapons useless against the ship's shields. The lights flickered, a familiar prelude to the promised power fluctuation. Rena knew, without checking the chronometer on her wrist, precisely when the containment field would falter. 2.3 seconds. Long enough to pass through, not long enough for the guards to react. As the azure energy shimmered and vanished, she moved, her bare feet making no sound on the cold metal floor. The corridor was unusually deserted, quieter than she'd ever heard it. Dan's words echoed in her mind, there's always a plan B. She just hadn't expected him to be part of it. He emerged from the shadows, a playful glint in his eyes. Impeccable timing, he murmured, drawing her toward a dim service corridor. Although, your peripheral vision could use some work. I've been standing here for a full minute. I was strategizing, Rena retorted, though she didn't pull away from his touch. His hand felt unexpectedly warm against her emerald skin. Right, he whispered near her ear. Wandering around a maximum security facility like you're browsing a souvenir shop. He steered her through the maze of maintenance tunnels. Unless you'd rather put on a performance for the security detail, the exit's this way. Rena let him lead her, acutely aware of his presence beside her, the occasional brush of their shoulders in the cramped passage. You orchestrated this, she stated softly, not a question. Every last detail. Almost every detail, Dan admitted, pausing at an intersection to consult a small device. You being even more striking in person wasn't factored into the initial calculations. And the flirting never stops, does it? She asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite the danger. Stop what? He countered, picking up their brisk pace. Would you prefer I didn't admire your qualities? Before Rena could reply, alarms shrieked through the station. Dan muttered a curse. That's a bit ahead of schedule. Time for Plan B. There's a Plan B? Rena asked, incredulous. There's always a Plan B, he reiterated, pulling her into a run. But be warned, this one involves a considerably larger number of explosions. They burst into a wider corridor just as a group of guards appeared around the corner. Rena instinctively lifted her hand, energy crackling at her fingertips, prepared to unleash the destructive force that had made her both notorious and feared. Hold on, Dan's hand tightened on her arm. Third panel on the left. Just enough to compromise the seal. Understanding dawned. With the precise control she seldom employed, Rena aimed a focused burst of energy at the indicated panel. It split along the seam, releasing a wave of suppressant gas designed to neutralize escaped detainees. Move! Dan yelled. They raced past the coughing, disoriented guards, Dan navigating the labyrinthine corridors with uncanny expertise. He must have committed the entire station layout to memory. Almost there, he gasped, as a heavy security door slammed down in front of them, blocking their path. And I presume, Rena said dryly, this is where Plan B makes its grand entrance. Dan grinned, retrieving a small object from his pocket. Fancy combining our skill sets? Rena assessed the door, then the object, a small explosive device. A slow smile spread across her face. "You know," she said, stepping closer, "most men just take me to dinner." "Tell you what," Dan replied, attaching the charge to the door, "we get out of this alive, and I'll make you the most memorable meal you've ever tasted." "Agreed? Is that a promise?" "It's a date." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting instant, the alarms, the approaching guards, the imminent threat, all seemed to fade. Then, Dan stepped back and detonated the charge. The explosion compromised the door's molecular integrity, and Rena released her power with surgical accuracy. The combined effect created a breach, just large enough for them to slip through. They stumbled into a small docking bay where a sleek, black vessel awaited. The sound of approaching boots echoed behind them. "After you," Dan said, gesturing to the ship's ramp. "Always the gentleman," Rena laughed, sprinting aboard. Dan followed, initiating the launch sequence before the ramp fully sealed. Through the viewport, Rena watched as guards flooded into the bay, their weapons ineffective against the ship's shields. The ship shuddered as Dan navigated through a particularly turbulent patch of hyperspace. "You know," Rena commented, her emerald skin reflecting the flickering lights of the console, "for a supposedly brilliant scientist, your navigational skills are questionable." "It's a shortcut," Dan retorted, adjusting the controls with a grin. "Besides, where's the fun in taking the scenic route?" He looked over at her, his eyes twinkling. "Unless you prefer predictable itineraries and boring, safe destinations?" "Predictable is not a word in my vocabulary anymore, thanks to you," Rena said dryly, though a smile tugged at her lips. "But I do prefer arriving at our destination in one piece." "Relax," Dan said, his voice teasing. "I've got everything under control. Mostly." He paused, his expression turning serious for a moment. "So, about that dinner date on Mars?" "You haven't forgotten," Rena said softly. "Have you?" "Forget?" Dan scoffed. "I've been planning this since, well, let's just say it's been a long time coming." He reached out, taking her hand in his. The familiar warmth of his touch sent a comforting tingle through her. "And I intend to make it memorable. Just try to avoid disintegrating the restaurant, okay?" Rena laughed. "No promises. Though I do have this new device you made. Maybe I can practice some controlled molecular rearrangements. Turn the silverware into butterflies, or something." "Butterflies?" Dan chuckled. "That's alarmingly romantic, even for you." The ship lurched again, and a warning light flashed on the console. Dan's easy smile vanished. "That's not good." "What is it?" Rena asked, her hand tightening on his. "I might have miscalculated the jump coordinates," Dan admitted, his voice tight. "We're somewhat off course." "Somewhat?" "As in, we appear to have landed in an alternate dimension. One with a slightly higher concentration of cosmic anomalies." Rena stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and amusement in her eyes. "You're serious?" Despite her exhaustion, Alana's smile turned playful. "Running away together?" "More like running toward something." Before Rena could respond, the ship's alarms blared, and the hull vibrated under a heavy impact. "Well," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "This is certainly unexpected. Just another Tuesday, right?" Dan grinned back, his eyes alight with a familiar spark of exhilaration. "Tell you what, we survived this, and I'll add another course to that dinner. Deal?" "Deal," Rena agreed, her own excitement rising. She felt a surge of power, a familiar thrill coursing through her veins. "Though, I'm warning you, if this dimension has giant space squids, I'm blaming you." "Space squids?" Dan laughed. "Don't be ridiculous. This is much more likely to involve temporal paradoxes and sentient nebulae. Though, if you're lucky, we might run into Elvis." "You might have mentioned that before." "Yeah, you know," Dan explained, as the ship rocked under another impact. "The king. Apparently, he faked his death and became a cosmic wanderer. I read about it in a highly credible tabloid." Rena shook her head, a mixture of fondness and exasperation in her expression. You're impossible. I prefer to improbable, Dan corrected, as he fought to regain control of the ship. Now, hold on tight. This is about to get interesting. And as the ship plunged deeper into the unknown, Rena realized that, with Dan by her side, interesting was just another word for adventure. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't so bad after all.